welcome. Thank you for being with us. My name is Russell Shorto. I am an author at W. Norton Publishers. And with me is my fellow Norton author, Mark Bradley. Norton, in their wisdom, have had the idea to occasionally pair up a couple of its authors and have them sort of interview each other via Zoom about their recent or soon to be published books. And I feel quite fortunate that I was paired with Mark Bradley because his book is really riveting. It's called Blood Runs Coal, and the subtitle is The Yablonski Murders and the Battle for the United Mine Workers of America. Mark, it's great to be with you. It's I want to say I really enjoyed the book. Enjoy is kind of a weird word for a book that's about a grisly triple murder, but you know, murder stories are something that people have been enjoying for a long time. But what you do in it is, yes, at heart, it's about this murder of a family, and it's got so much atmosphere in a kind of lonely farmhouse over the Christmas holidays. But really, it seems to me, your subject matter is power in America and how it works and the dark avenues by which it often flows. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very poetic, and that's absolutely right, Russ. It's a book about, like yours. I mean, a different time in America when power, especially in labor, actually still meant something. That there was a real struggle for these labor unions and for control. Who was going to run them? I mean, we're talking in 1969, 1/3 of the American workforce, non-agricultural, belonged to labor unions. Now it's fewer than 6%. It's a different time. And as you so eloquently point out in Smalltime, the story of my family and the mob, which we'll get to in a minute, you've got coal, iron, and steel in Western Pennsylvania, and not a hell of a lot else. And you either fit into those categories or you don't. And that's one of the fascinating things about your book that I liked. I mean, you were showing a different snapshot of America too at a different time. I mean, I love your line about the mob being as American as a hot dog in the 1950s and 1960s. And again, I mean, you grew up in Johnstown. My grandfather was from up around that same area. And it's such a unique area to write about and to be trying to describe. You want to talk about Johnstown a little bit and why you did what you did? I mean,
I think Norton paired us because both books are set in southwestern Pennsylvania. And it's all, it's a unique part of the country with its own logic. And I can't say, even though I was born and raised there, I can't say that I truly get it, but researching a book. So my book is called Smalltime, and it comes out in February. And it's about my grandfather who I've always known that he, along with his brother-in-law, ran the mob in town. And in effect, they ran the town. But I grew up, I guess I internalized this kind of vow of silence, like nobody really talked about it. But you know how when you're a kid, adults say things, somehow you just soak it in. So I knew a good bit, I guess, about it, but I also knew not to talk about it. And then, and this was in Johnstown, which is kind of a satellite city to Pittsburgh, and both were very powerful, rollicking places in that corner of Pennsylvania. And so since there was money there, the mob was there. And then a few years ago, after I have written several books of narrative history, a relative said to me, "Hey, you're a writer. What are you going to do about the story?" And I said, "What story?" And he said, "Your grandfather, the mob." And I realized that it was like he burst the bubble. I realized that there was no need really to keep this vow of silence anymore. I mean, all these people are dead. This is history. So then I suddenly felt this urgency. You know, I had to pull together what information I could. I had to tell this story because, these guys didn't keep notebooks. It's not like it's going to linger forever. So, my story is about the small town mob in Western Pennsylvania, and yours is about coal mining and the United Mine Workers, and takes place in that same part of the state. And they're both, it's a gritty place. People are very, I think, very religious, very earnest. There's not a lot of irony. And at the same time, it's a place where I guess you have to say illegal activity has often proliferated at the same time.
Yeah, no, indeed. What do you think that is? I mean, what is it about that particular area that draws that? Is it lack of opportunity? Is it something else?
Well, researching my family and the mob, I was struck by, for one thing, I was struck by parallels with today, especially in my grandfather's early days when he was coming up. I mean, he was a child of Sicilian immigrants, and these people had come to work in the coal mines in Western Pennsylvania, and they were able to make a better living than they had in Sicily, which was, desperately poor. But they were essentially ostracized from American society. They couldn't open bank accounts. They were paid slightly less than Black workers. They were given only the most dangerous jobs. And so they kind of created, and yet the funny thing is they really admired American capitalism, the robber barons. I mean, everything they did, my grandfather and his brother-in-law, was kind of a copy of what the big guys were doing, Ford and so they were simply creating their own structure, paralleling the establishment one, I think.
Yeah, their own version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So it's a strange and I grew up there, and I grew up, it seemed like Yablonski, that name, these murders, echoed through my childhood. And I guess, I think that crime must have riveted the nation, but it certainly particularly did that corner of the state.
It did. As you and I were talking on Saturday, we both grew up in the 60s. And you couldn't grow up in that decade and not be affected by the number of political assassinations that took place. I mean, no matter what the distemper is today, we don't do that anymore, knock on wood. We don't shoot our politicians. I don't know whether Twitter takes care of that or what. But the Yablonski murders took place on New Year's Eve, 1969. I mean, the last day of the year of what was an extraordinarily bloody decade. And, in a way, I've always thought the Yablonski's murders were kind of like the last civil rights murders of the 1960s. I mean, Jock Yablonski ran as in that 1969 UMWA presidential election to clean up the Union. And he was trying to actually bring the Union back to what it once was decades ago, a democratic force of social good. And it cost him his life. And the irony of that was he actually knew it was going to cost him his life. He told Ralph Nader, when Nader talked him into running in May of 1969, he said, "Ralph, you don't understand. This is I'll likely not going to make it." And unfortunately, he was absolutely right about that. I don't know of any politician today who runs and thinks he or she's going to be assassinated. But it was that peculiar overlay of the 1960s on this environment that you and I both are writing about, this physical environment, this social milieu down in southwestern Pennsylvania. I mean, it's odd. I was in Clarksville when I was writing the book, and I had a trouble getting a cup of coffee on Saturday. I mean, the town was dead. I mean, you saw it was once a vibrant place. I mean, it was a working man's town, and it was just dead. I mean, on Johnstown.
And this is so true of course, so many towns around the country, but in particular in this part of Pennsylvania, in Johnstown, it was, there's barely 20,000 people now, and there's lots of boarded up buildings. And, in the time I'm writing about, in mid 20th century, they called it Little Chicago. You know, it
Right.
was booming, it was bustling. Of course, the coal mines on the outskirts of town, and in particular the steel mills.
Deal.
Everybody was connected to the mill. Everybody, you know, you heard the whistles for the changing of shifts going, and
Right.
you saw the smoke pouring out of the factories, and so that was, you know, it is such a different time. So you know, one strange thing is it seems so alien today, and this is, you kind of alluded to it, that a power struggle within a labor union would result in the murder of a family.
That was the
I mean,
last time.
that's just a feature of
Well,
a different time.
it's the last time labor unions were important enough to be killed over. I mean, that's where we've come to in this country, which is, again, you think of 1968, the year before, Hubert Humphrey went to the UMWA convention to kick off his political run for the presidency. I mean, now, I mean, unions at best are an afterthought. I know Biden has given at least some attention to them, but the big unions today are public unions. The teachers union is much more powerful than the United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers, United Mine Workers. Back in the day, though, I mean, especially the United Mine Workers, it was the richest union in the country. It had more money than the Teamsters and the steel workers combined. I mean, it was an enormously wealthy union. The problem was it didn't do anything with it except just kind of hoard it, and especially among the very top, the top of the heap of the union. I mean, the average guys in the coal field were slipping like this, but the wages of the president and the pensions were going this way, and the workers' pensions were going that way. And that's one of the things that angered Yablonski.
And just for those who didn't grow up with it,
Right.
what's the nature of the struggle? You have Jock Yablonski and Tony Boyle, and they're locking horns.
It's interesting. Yeah, Yablonski in 1969 is 59 years old. He's just about on the verge of retirement. And he had been president of District 5, which back in the day encompassed southwestern Pennsylvania. It was one of the most powerful and wealthiest parts of the union. He was also a member of the International Executive Board, their College of Cardinal. So a longtime union official, been there since the early 30s. And he and Boyle had clashed for decades over the direction the union was going to go. John L. Lewis brought Boyle to Washington in 1957. Boyle was from Montana. And he had kind of an inside track. As you mentioned in your book, I mean, about ethnic discrimination. Yablonski was Polish. And in those days, the UMWA, the front office, was reserved for Anglo-Irish Welsh. You didn't bring Poles into the upper echelon. So Yablonski was kind of stymied at a level. He was very distraught at about the way that Boyle was running the union. In fact, Boyle didn't really run the union. The union pretty much just was, there was no real direction from Washington except to make sure the coal industry was happy, make sure safety was at a minimum, and to make sure that the pension funds grew for the people who actually had the highest jobs. The workers were pretty much neglected. In November 20th, 1968, an explosion took place out in close to Fairmont, West Virginia, that killed 78 coal miners. And Boyle came to the site and praised standing there right in front of the smoking portals of the mine, praised the mine safety record. And it's like, excuse me, you have 78 of your guys in here, and this got killed, and you're praising this. That enraged Yablonski, but more importantly, it also enraged Ralph Nader. Nader, you know, the great safety consumer, he was coming off being GM'd the heel on the Corvair. And he became very interested. He had been before, but just kind of galvanized, interested in mine safety. But he realized that mine safety was worthless unless you had an honest union who was going to police it. So that's why he got involved in it, and that's why he was able to talk Yablonski into running, because he said, you know, you can't leave the union, into these kind of hands. That, you know, your workers are actually dying. Not only are their wages slipping, but now they're being killed on the job in a way that's just completely outrageous. So
Boyle decides to off his opponent.
Kill him, yeah. Yablonski announced he was going to run on May 29th, 1969 here at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. 3 weeks later, Boyle ordered his execution. And you ask yourself, I mean, wait a minute, you've got the richest union in the country. You can get lobbyists, you can get lawyers. I mean, you can run the campaign any way you want. That wasn't the way it was done. You wanted to send a message down through the ranks that you did not challenge the head of the union. It was a dictatorship, and he considered Yablonski to be a traitor. And Yablonski was in the inner circle, and now he was actually betraying it, according to Boyle. So he had to be taken care of. I mean, it's astonishing, really. You think about it.
And why did he think he would get away with it?
You know, that's a fascinating question. It's almost as if these guys were in a hermetically sealed box. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is this takes place again. We've had the civil rights movement in the 1960s. We've had everything going on around the anti-Vietnam stuff. Watergate's will soon happen, and yet Boyle seems to be in this kind of insulated box where the outside world doesn't mean anything. This is the way we've always done it. This is the way we're going to keep doing it. And so it's an astonishing just lack of awareness, I mean, of the worst kind. I mean, so and the FBI stepped in after the killings, and it took them 4 years to actually bring Tony Boyle to justice. But they were able to do it, and so I mean, it's a Shakespearean story in the way that it's got tremendous courage. It's got unspeakable savagery. It's got betrayal. It's got the atmosphere up in southwestern Pennsylvania. I mean, it's a dark, but in the end, I like to think of it as being somewhat of a redemptive story that Yablonski's followers were able to take over the Union in 1972, and they're able to make it among the most democratically run unions in the country. The problem is another tragedy happens. That's the economics begin to roll against the coal industry in a way that they can't, no matter how democratic they are, they can't stop. So you ask yourself, I mean, in the end, what was all this for? And again, back to your story. I mean, you think about your father's a particularly interesting guy, Russ. I mean, he's the son of a monster. Will you talk a little bit about how he dealt with that and how he reconciled the world with that?
You know, these kinds of issues, I mean, these are very, in both cases here, both stories, these are very American stories and issues. And so much of it is really about power and about power being exercised without a whole lot of regulation, I guess you would say. I mean, that's right. the case with the union, a labor union, just kind of running amok. And also, I mean, that's what I saw. I mean, I knew as much about the mob as anybody, or as little as anybody before I really dug into this. And I think that when you're, or in my case, when you're researching a story that's your own, which was quite different for me, researching a family story, it gives it this whole other intensity. And so the book is really about my grandfather, who I was named after, but who I barely knew. I mean, I maybe met him 2 or 3 times when I was very young. I always knew that he and my father, his eldest son, had a very tense relationship. And so I was very hesitant to involve my father in my research into his father. Because I guess, I knew that there was all this, a whole lifetime of difficulty there, psychological difficulty. But I finally asked him if he would help. And he said, yes, he wanted to. And I was amazed at how much he knew, because he was a kid and he was kept, kind of on the outskirts, but he knew a great deal about the workings of the operation. And there was, in the middle of working on this book, I had this kind of revelation where I had been brought up with this notion that my grandfather had tried to bring his son into the business. And my father, who at that time was just married and was going to have to start a family and all that, valiantly, said no, and that caused this friction, this split between them. I learned that from some of the other old guys, the old boys who I talked with, that in fact, it was exactly the opposite. My father had desperately wanted in, and his father, I guess knowing that this is not a life for someone, refused. And he would actually beat him up when he found him hanging out at the pool hall, which was kind of the center of their operation. So, you know, you're talking about things like the mob in America, that's one thing. But if you're talking about your own family and seeing these dynamics and having these kind of revelations where you have to, in the middle of your research, go back to your father and say, Dad, you know, what's up here, you know, and then, you know, discovering that my dad, as a teenager, was like this gun wielder for a while and was going around town, you know, robbing stores, essentially to try to impress his father. He was auditioning for a job. And my dad, who in my whole life was a very sweet, upstanding citizen in town, but that was the backstory. So, you know, it complicates things when you're looking at these, you know, issues like the mob in America, and you know, whenever, and you know what, I kind of feel that having anybody who researches their family, their own family now, if you get deep enough, there, you know, there are every family story is, you brought up the term Shakespearean, has these, you know, dramas and betrayals and, you know, what people have done for love, and you know, and it's all there right behind us. You know, you think, maybe you think your family's boring. I guarantee you it's not.
You know, it's interesting. Both my kids now have found out that their great-great-grandfathers fought for the Confederacy, the Civil War. I mean, from Virginia. And so how do you reconcile with that? I mean, you're spot on family history being complicated. Anyway, you talk about the rise of the mob. I mean, and you do a fascinating job, because I mean, most of us think about the mob as the big mafia. You know, the 5 families in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, obviously Las Vegas, Miami. You talk about the mob in a way that I have never seen it done before, and it's almost as American as apple pie or as a hot dog. And it's in these places like Johnstown and Fresno, Wichita. It's not the mob as we think, but still, it starts the same way. It's prohibition and it's gambling. I mean, it's just kind of universal American appetites are taken advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Yablonski being Polish and having that as kind of an impediment to him. And that was very much the case with Italians. And so the mob was one response, and it came out of Prohibition. And, you know, I used to think that Prohibition was basically a movement started by these, you know, righteous, pious ladies to stop men folk from, you know, hanging out at bars or whatever. There was a huge, I mean, so much that was going on in the 1920s, exactly a century ago. We're back there. We're back there again. It was a moment of a time of incredible anti-immigrant fervor. The country was deeply divided. There were, and Prohibition was, one of the motivations behind Prohibition was to get at these new immigrant groups, the Catholics, Italians, Irish, because it was felt that their cultures revolved around alcohol. You know, they weren't, you know, we're these pious, very abstemious Protestants, and here are these newcomers, and they're, you know, sort of a lower order, and they can't control themselves, and so, and it was attack on them and on elites, on urban elites, you know, so you have a kind of similar divide in society to now. And never mind the fact that it was American companies that had advertised. I mean, the streets of Messina in Italy had posters saying, you know, we'll come to America, we'll pay your fare, and you can work in the mines, and it'll be a good job. So these people did, and then they, you know, then the repercussions came. So, you know, I don't know, you know, I guess one of the questions I was going to ask you was, granted, labor unions are a shadow of what they used to be, but in terms of power and the way it is exercised and the way things really work in this country, have we, I mean, there was reform within the mine workers at the end of your story, but have we really progressed?
Probably not. I mean, I guess the biggest progression we have made, though, is in some ways in safety. I mean, we no longer have the huge mine explosions that killed hundreds of workers at one blast. That said, I mean, black lung is now as bad as it was, if not worse. So it's almost become less important, certainly less known, less covered in the media. So in a way, I mean, the biggest difference is unions, no matter what they were, and again, as you correctly point out, the Yablonski murders were front page news in this country for a long, long time. I mean, they were followed, and they were followed all the way up to the White House. That's how important they were. Yet now, I mean, to get a labor union story on any paper, I mean, certainly the Washington Post down here doesn't cover labor, or how do they, you know, and so it's changed, but it hasn't changed. You know, if that's an intelligible answer at all.
Well, let me ask this. You were with the Department of Justice.
Correct.
And with the CIA. You're a lawyer.
Yep.
What brought you to this story? Why did you decide you wanted to? Is it an exploration of justice in America and how it works and doesn't work?
Kind of. I mean, it was funny. I was finishing up my first book, and I was up at the Library of Congress checking some footnotes, and I was waiting for the boxes to come, and I was just kind of thumbing through the Library of Congress's manuscript division holdings, and I noticed they had just gotten in a collection called the Joseph A. Yablonski Legal Case Collection, and had 26 boxes. And again, like you, I remembered the killings, and so I just asked one of the librarians to bring me a box. And I opened it, and I realized that this was they were from Washington County, Pennsylvania, where these records were from. They were the government's investigation and prosecution of the Yablonski killers, and there it was. I mean, it was, and they even had a bullet, one of the bullets in a plastic tube. I mean, it was all there, the photographs, the whole thing. And so I made a mental note to myself to just what's been written on the Yablonski murder. And I went back, and nothing had been written on them in over 50 years. There had been a spate of books written in the mid-70s as the trials were going on by journalists. But nobody had yet tried to put these murders into any type of historical context. I'm not criticizing those books. They were of their time. In fact, I used them in my own research because they were firsthand accounts of what was going on. So I thought 50 years, is kind of the sweet spot because you still have people who are alive to remember what went on, yet you have also archival documents. So it's a very rich area to work in. So I just began to dig and dig and dig, and I became fascinated, again, by this snapshot of America at a different time when labor unions actually meant something. And secondly, again, this idea of this man going forward, knowing he's probably not going to make it, he's going to be assassinated. He never dreamed that they would wipe out his daughter and wife at the same time. That wasn't done in this country. But just this idea of the unions being that important enough, you put your life on the line. And, I was talking the other night or another interview that labor history in this country is just not taught anymore. It just isn't. You can't find it in almost any college curriculum in the country, even schools like Pitt, Wayne State, Carnegie Mellon, even those schools that are right in the labor area, still really don't teach labor history or teach it enough. And so I wanted to remind people that, where do you think the 8-hour workday came from? Where do you think pensions came from? Where do you think health insurance came from? Where do you think sick leave came from? All came out of the union movement, and the people died to get those benefits. I mean, you could be killed, or things like that. And what a peculiar time to describe, and especially to people now who just take this stuff for granted, that it just didn't drop out of the sky. I mean, people really had to put themselves on the line to get these what we consider fundamental rights now, or just basically necessities. And so it was an opportunity, again, for the personal story and also the historical, to put it in context and to describe a bit of this country that's gone, that we've lost.
Yeah. You said about 50 years being the sweet spot. That was the striking thing for me working on my book. I write narrative histories, but most of my books are, the story takes place 300 or 400 years ago. So here, for the first time, not only is it personal to me, but it's within living memory. That actual generation I'm focused on, my grandfather and his cohort, those people were gone. But what I realized was the next generation was still around, and they, it was I'm talking about my father's father. but it was my mother's cousin who was the one who kind of popped the bubble for me. And I said, well, my first question to him, and it turned out my mother's cousin was, had been a numbers runner and worked in the pool hall for my grandfather. And he had left town. He was a jazz musician. He went to Las Vegas and he spent his whole career there playing stand-up bass and sing. And he's a singer, you know, very nice voice. And he came back home. He retired, moved back to Johnstown, and it was over Christmas. And we went to see him at a club, and that's where he kind of popped this bubble for me. And my first question to him though was, well, you know, where's the information? It's all gone, right? And he said, if you're serious, you come and talk to me.
Right. Yeah.
And so so I did. I decided, all right, I'll spend a week just seeing what's there. And he said, meet me at my hangout, Panera Bread. So I met him at Panera Bread, and I thought it was going to be just the two of us. I, you know, put on my tape recorder and we sat down and with our coffee. Little old guy comes up, another one, about 8 guys around us. He had put out the word. And these old men, these little old Italian men with their canes and everything, they had been the ones who admired and looked up to my grandfather and his brother-in-law. And so it was still, as you say, it was within living memory. And then what I became interested in which is another similarity, another overlap between these two books, is putting together oral history with, I mean, because, you know, these are old guys and they've been swapping these stories forever. You know, this is great. This is fascinating. This is hair raising. But do I believe this?
Right.
So then you look for documentation, you look for other sources, you look for, you know, and then I had, because it's a small town, I had, my dad knew the chief of police. He gave me a key to their archive room, which was like a big walk-in closet with all these cardboard boxes in it.
Yeah.
So then you're looking, by God, he was arrested on that day, you know? So it's a different kind of, you know, putting together a historical story is a puzzle, and it's a very different kind of puzzle when it's within living memory.
No, it is. Well, let me ask you 2 questions that intrigue me. One is, what finally put an end to the mob in Johnstown, and what was it?
Well, the broad answer, not just in Johnstown, but everywhere, has to do with money. If the money isn't there, then, and this is, you know, when I went to my great-grandfather's hometown in Sicily, I said, well, what happened? Why isn't the mob here? And he said, look at us. We don't have any money.
That's what you steal, right?
Yeah, right. So there's that. And then the government crackdown. And you know, in my story kind of revolves around the murder of a bookie.
Right.
And my grandfather and most of the characters in the story were suspects in this.
Pippi DeFalco.
Yeah, Pippi DeFalco. And that happened right as JFK came into the White House, as Bobby Kennedy was doing his Attorney General, and he was cracking down on the mob, including the small town mob. That was a real focus of his. So it was the beginning of the end, that Johnstown had a murder among its mobsters right as that was happening, which immediately, suddenly, the mayor of the town is communicating with the Attorney General, with Bobby
General of the United States.
So that really, I mean, of course, it lived on for years, but, you know, in nothing like the way it was. Yeah.
And also, too, I mean, how did this book change you? I mean, you go through this, I mean, your family history here. I mean, how did it alter you now? I mean, how were you changed by doing this?
You know, I think everybody ought to do family history. I mean, if you have but you have to realize, here's the fundamental thing. I referenced this before. You have a certain understanding of your family, your background, your parents, whoever, how your family came to America, whatever the story is. It's kind of right and it's kind of wrong. And if you explore it, you have to be willing to have that little story fractured, because
have a strong stomach.
Yeah, I mean, typically that was fashioned for you and it was appropriate for a child's understanding.
Right.
And if you're going to do a sort of grown-up exploration, then you are saying that you're ready to to get beneath that and get complicated. And since I worked on the book, I taught a creative writing workshop, and I made it writing family history. And my students said, this was at Baruch College in New York. They're from all over the world. And I wanted them each to come up with 3 family stories. And suddenly we had like this avalanche of stories from all over the world. And people, and the one thing in common was the kids thought in the beginning, here's the story of my grandparents and here's how they met, and I want to tell it, and it was a great love affair. And then as the kid explores it, he realizes my grandparents hated each other. You know, every story kind of gets turned on its head as you explore it.
No, well, that's great. I mean, it's a great book. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was watching the football game yesterday, one of them, and I kept losing track of the score because I was so absorbed in turning the pages of this.
Who needs football?
Yeah, well, right. But I mean, it throws light on not only family history, but also, again, like my book does, on a different time in this country. When things
I have to thank Norton for putting us together, and Mark, I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and best of luck to you with it.
Same to you, my friend. Thank you.